Well, thank you everyone for coming to listen to our presentation about our project for the last few months. We have been working to use satellite images to predict the times that flowers have been blooming. So today, what we would like to do is first tell you a bit about what we've done and some of the results that we have. Then we want to talk a little bit about what goes into making a good fit and some suggestions for improving the fit as the project continues. And finally, we want to talk about some future improvements to this work and also some future implications that could follow from this project. Now, so we'll start with what we did. Now, the seasons have been changing as long as the Earth has been here. And also, people have been watching the seasons as long as humans have been here. So this is nothing new. But recently, this has given rise to the science of phenology, which is the study of seasonal change. So here we see an olive plant as it changes through the year. And one important seasonal change is the beginning of spring. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think of spring, I think of flowers. And here we see a bunch of flowers. And because of this, flowers and the beginning of blooming is a good proxy for the start of spring. And there's actually quite a bit of work already being done for the beginning of flowering. So here we see a map made by the American National Phenology Network of when lilac begins to bloom. So this is not actual measurements, but this is a model they have made that uses temperature and weather data as input and then predicts in each location when lilac will start to bloom. So in the green and yellow at the bottom, it's blooming earlier, and then in the red and purple near the top, those are later days. Now this is a nice model. They even give you like a full 6-day forecast based on the reliable weather forecast for the week ahead. But there are definitely some improvements to be made. So what we wanted to do in this project is do something similar to this first bloom model, but with two differences. First of all, we want to make predictions for the year ahead. So we don't just want to infer when the bloom happened in the past with past data, but hopefully make some sort of prediction. And the second thing is we want to use satellite images as our input instead of temperature and weather. Now, why would we want to do this? Well, there are a few interesting things. This is interesting because if this works, it shows that satellite images have the information needed to tell us about spring. But it's also, of course, useful for scientists who want to do things like study climate change. If we can track when spring has occurred, that gives us useful information, and predictions are also useful. And it's also easy to imagine predictions of spring as being useful for things like resource management and agriculture when you want your crop to be blooming at the same time as there are pollinators around. So there are lots of potential uses for a technology like this.
So after introducing our motivation and a brief background introduction for our project, we would like to talk about our research problem more specifically. So our sponsor Josephine worked on the flowering onset problem, which is to infer the first bloom date with a whole year time series MODIS 8-day satellite data as the input features. For our project, the research problem is pretty similar, and we try to shrink the input time range from a whole year down to a shorter period of time, such as a couple of months. We believe that this model would be more suitable and flexible for practical cases where we only have small pieces of incomplete data within a certain time interval. Also, to make more accurate predictions, we switch from the MODIS 8-day satellite data to the daily data because we want to get more frequent data points. The input time series data could either cover the bloom onset date or be ahead of the bloom date. So we hope that our model could realize two goals: to predict and to infer the bloom date. The output would be a single number corresponding to the day of year, such as 443. The primary data we use as the input features to our machine learning models is the MODIS satellite images. The multi-satellite data is extracted from Google Earth Engine. We focus on a region located in the northeast US to be our major study region for our project. The 8-day satellite data contains 13 bands. 7 of them indicate the surface reflectance with respect to different wavelengths. The daily data contains 8 bands, and 2 of them are red and infrared spectral bands. We exclude some bands, such as the quality bands and the zenith bands, and mainly rely on the spectral bands as well as the corresponding day of year to train our model. One obvious difference between the two types of data we have is the frequency of the data points. Another thing we should probably pay attention to is that the pixels in an 8-day period data will be carefully selected within the 8-day period. However, the daily data could be in a poor quality. We attempted training the model with both types of data. The details about our performance evaluation and comparison among different models will be introduced in later sections. We trained our model to predict a metric called first bloom index, which was also mentioned in the previous section by Duncan. To recap, the first bloom index is a temperature-based metric provided by National Phenology Network. It is a rough proxy to the flowering onset date based on the historical observations and some temperature information. Here are 3 first bloom index plots on the screen, which are from 2001, 2008, and 2015, based on the daily 250 meter resolution data. The white area includes ocean pixels, which we treat as embedded pixels and will not load into the model for training and testing purpose. From the plots, we can see that the index changes year to year. For example, at the bottom left corner, the indices are smaller in 2008 compared to the other 2 plots. These plots could be used as comparisons to the maps of predictions for model evaluation. In addition, the observations from the plots could lead us to some future improvements, such as taking the spatial neighboring relationship into consideration when we improve the model. As a brief summary, we use multi-satellite data as the input and first bloom index as the target. Before we go into details about the model architecture, we would also like to introduce how we split up the data we have. We took the data from 2001 to 2014 as the training set, 2015 to 2017 as the validation set, and 2018 to 2020 as the test set. The training set is used to train the machine learning model, as explained by its name. The validation set could be used to check if there is any overfitting problem, which means the model fits too much to the training data set and will fail to fit any additional data. The test set will not be touched until the very final stages, where it will be used to evaluate the overall performance.
Okay, so the next question is, what kind of model can we use to make these predictions? So we're going to talk about what model we use and also why we chose this architecture. Now, recall that as inputs, our model will take 1 pixel over however many images we have. So it's only looking at 1 pixel at a time. And also the day of year of these images, so it knows when they were taken, and the cosine calendar, which is something we came up with that's sort of similar to the day of year, and we'll talk more about that later. As output, our model will give us a day that blooming will start. And so what goes between the inputs and the outputs? We use something called a residual temporal convolutional neural network, which sounds very fancy and looks fancy. So we're not going to go into all the details, but let's delve a little bit into what's going on here. So the key idea behind neural networks is that we can build a model of a bunch of different layers, where each layer has a bunch of numbers that we calculate based on the previous layers. How we calculate these numbers are controlled by other numbers called weights, and the weights change as we train. So when we talk about the model learning, what that really means is we're changing the weights so that our prediction gets more accurate. So what's special about convolutional neural networks is these layers are related by convolutions. So this means that each number in a higher up layer depends on certain nearby numbers in a lower layer. So it's only depending on nearby numbers. And also, we have a set of weights that gives us this linear transformation, kind of illustrated by these red lines. And we can then apply the same transformation to all areas in our image. So this is how a convolutional neural network works. We can also introduce a dilation. So this is with no dilation, but here's a dilation size 2 or a dilation size 4. The idea with these is that this way our output can depend on input numbers that are further away. So we get kind of a longer time span that we can look at. Now, we can of course combine a bunch of these layers together. So what we did is we start with some layers that have no dilation, so we can maybe learn some microscopic features of what's going on. And then later on, we start increasing the amount of dilation in higher layers so that we get more of a bird's eye perspective of what's going on. And the model can learn longer temporal phenomena. So finally, at the end, we have this layer, but we want to convert this into a single number that is our prediction. And how do we convert a bunch of numbers into a single number? Well, we just do some sort of average, right? So we end up with a number at the end when we take the mean over the final layer. And then we can do this whole thing many times, like 128 times. So we end up with 128 of these numbers at the end that we then do another combination in some way that we learn into a final prediction of 162 or some other number. So why is this architecture a good choice? This is the same architecture used by Josephine in her past work that we discussed. And she chose it because of this paper by Bai et al. They find that this architecture is very effective for time series signals when we want to have some sort of memory over time. So it's useful for signal processing, natural language processing, and it turns out predicting bloom dates.
Okay, and when we are training the model, we might want to take some of the knowledge from the previous whole model, and since we are trying to make our model predicting with shorter information or less information, we might want to do the transfer learning. What is the transfer learning? Transfer learning means like a research that previously focusing on recognizing any vehicles. And the model that used to be recognizing a vehicle can also be specialized to only recognizing a truck. So in this case, we can either use these two methods to pad the other places that we are not masked. And I guess I can show this one first. The first method is called imputed data, which means only the green part are the real data, the blue part are imputed data. By imputed, I mean these data are calculated from a previous historical year's data, and we actually use the median, but we can also use average or node, something like that. The reason we want to do that is that we want to get a general idea of what these places should be, or like empirically should be. So they are not from any year's real data, but they are reasonable data for our model to focusing on the other part, which is the green part. And we noticed that as we decreasing the real data ratio and increasing the imputed data ratio, we are expecting higher possibility of overfitting when we have a lot of real data. But if we are going to do this, take this one as the training, that means we are having more imputed data, and hopefully our training set will lead our model to be a more general model that can be performed better in a new sample in the future. Yeah, so all these work are aiming to improve the generalizability for our model when it encounters new data. And another way to do this is that we can remove some data. We do not impute data, we just remove it. Because in our case, as Duncan just mentioned, our model can actually accept variable lengths of data. So it's not like we have to feed in a fixed length of data. We can feed in any length of data. So we can just feed in less data, and hopefully it can be performs the same thing, same performance, have the same performance with the previous approach. And this approach, we can also save some time because we are actually calculating less, doing less calculation than the previous one. And hopefully we can still have a high accuracy when doing that. So that is two approach. The first one is padding with fake but reasonable data. And in our case, we use median. And the second approach is pad those places with nothing, which means we ignore those places completely since we can input variable lengths. Okay.
Good, so now is the exciting part when we talk about our results. Let's start by looking at the results for one model that we trained that ended up being our favorite model. So this is a model that we trained with the daily images. This is where we have one image per day. And how this works is we start by training the model where the entire input is real data. So we start with September 1st until August 31st, and it's all just real. And then gradually, as training progresses, we move to the left on this chart and decrease the length of real data. And the rest is filled in with this imputed data, the historical median. And we keep going as we're training, gradually decreasing the length of real data until we get to 88 days of real data at the end. So the real portion is September 1st until 88 days later. So January 1st or so, we're starting our imputed data until the end of the year. Now in this brown color, we see the error on the training set. So this is how well the model performs as it's training on the stuff it's seeing to learn from. And we'll notice that pretty quickly, this error gets to around 3 or so. So that means that the predictions are generally 3 days off from the target. We notice that in yellow, the error on the validation set is a bit larger. So this tells us how well the model is doing on data that it hasn't seen before. And even so, though, this error gets fairly small to around 5. So by the end, we're about 5 days off from the target bloom date, and with only 88 days of real data that we're feeding in. So this looks pretty promising. That's kind of nice. Is it good enough? We'll have to wait until a future slide to find out. One thing I want to point out before moving on as well is that you'll notice the validation error is larger than the training error. This is called overfitting. It means that maybe we've learned a little too much from our training data. This is not ultimately a problem, though, as long as our validation error is low. And it was pretty consistent, in this case at least, that we had 1.5 times as much error in the validation set as the training set, and that happened in most of our runs. So moving on to the next thing, let's now start comparing this to other runs. So here we have a bunch of runs for the plot we just saw for the daily data. In blue are the runs where we add the imputed data to the end, and in red are the runs where we don't add any imputed data, we just shorten the length of the input. And you'll notice that the blue runs look a lot better, except for this outlier at the top, but they all seem to decrease the error very nicely as we continue training, whereas the ones where we don't add the imputed data, the error stays fairly constant. So let's take a closer look at these blue runs with the imputed data. Here's a plot of them. The run that we looked at the beginning is this orange one at the bottom, but you'll notice that in general, we had several runs that were roughly comparable with the outlier on top. If we can also, here's a plot of the red runs. These are the ones without imputed data. And the error here is around 10, which is much worse than the error of 5 that we saw before. And finally, here is a similar plot where we train with 8-day images. Now, the 8-day images are a little bit more complex, so we didn't try imputing data with those. So this is only the method where we shorten the input without imputed data. Now, you'll notice here that the error gets fairly good down to 5 when we have lots of real data, but as we shorten it, the error gets worse again. And the error here was worse than what we saw with the imputed data earlier. So we decided to focus on this method of daily images for further investigations. With that said, you will notice that if we compare these 8-day runs to the ones of daily images without the imputed data, the 8-day images have a lower error. It was, by the end, it was around 8 or so, whereas these ones were around 10. So this means that the 8-day data is promising in that it has the potential to give us a better model eventually if we maybe add some imputed 8-day data as well. Now, actually, we can look at this a little bit more because you may recall one key difference between the 8-day data and the daily data is that the daily images have all these clouds, these nasty atmospheric hazes and stuff that gets in the way, whereas for the 8-day images, we choose all of the pixels so that we avoid the clouds and we always take good quality images. So the question is, does this pre-processing help? And the answer is, it looks like it does. So here we've done several runs with the 8-day data in this red color, and several runs with daily images, but where we only take one image every 8 days. And that's what we see in blue. So the thick line is the mean over several runs, and then the shaded region spans between the minimum and the maximum value that we saw. Each of these is based on like 6 to 8 runs. And we'll notice that the 8-day runs had a lower error, and so it does seem like this extra pre-processing of eliminating clouds helps. This is something that we probably want to consider in the future of the project. So let's now take a closer look at the best run that we saw at the very beginning.
So on the slides, we have some of the maps of the predicted values and the actual labels. So the leftmost plot is the map of predictions, and the middle plot is the map of labels, and the rightmost plot is the difference plot calculated by labels minus prediction, where red means that the predicted bloom date is ahead of the first bloom index that we want to predict, and the blue means the opposite way. So the 3 plots in this animation are produced using the exact same model, but the data was from different test years. So we can see that the plot of labels are changing among 3 different years, and the color distributions on the right plot are also quite different. But now let's watch a short animation comparing the maps with different models from the selected epochs along one training process, which are all generated with the test set from year 2020. So this epoch, the epoch 23, corresponds to the initial stage of our training process. At the beginning, the difference plot on the right has a pretty high saturated red and blue colors. With the training going on, we can tell that the colors become lighter, which means the magnitude of the differences decrease. Also, the red and blue distribution keeps almost the same with different models along the training process. At some points, the colors darkened a little bit compared with the plot just before it. But from the complete animation, we can still conclude that the overall trend of the difference is becoming smaller. This proves that our model indeed improves along the training process. And finally, let's zoom in a little bit more when we observe the maps. So this is one pair of plots generated with the test data from 2019. We could see that the predictions and the labels share some similar patterns. So for example, there is a rather light spot within the red circle on the center in both plots. Also, the orange rectangles both surround a light green strip. The area in the purple circle is slightly brighter than the surroundings for both clouds in the same way. This observation supports our conclusion that the model could successfully learn some features from the satellite images.
Okay, so this is the part where we find out if the model actually worked. So one thing that would be nice would be to compare our model with some sort of naive prediction. So to do this, we figured out the average, or the mean bloom date over our training set for each pixel, and then we can make sort of a naive model where we always just guess the historical mean for this pixel. So what we'll notice is that the best run that we had was just slightly worse than this naive model. So that's not that encouraging. However, there is good news because in a way, what this shows us is that the model was able to learn to distinguish pixels from one another. This is like what we saw on the map as well, that it does a good job of learning just looking at a pixel's satellite images, whether this is a pixel that has an early or a late spring date. What it's not been able to do very well is learn about the variance from year to year as far as making a good prediction for this year as opposed to other years. So this does not mean that these problems are not surmountable. So like it's very possible that if we continue training, maybe when the models finish learning this easy stuff, like which pixels have early dates compared to late dates, maybe then it will start to continue learning maybe harder stuff, like what is happening this year. But also, if we think about it, by the time we get to the lower lengths of real data, the model is mostly seeing imputed data, which is the same for each year. So it sort of makes sense that if it's seeing mostly imputed data, it might have a hard time learning the differences from year to year. So it might be necessary to add some sort of training technique to help it focus on the real data portion. Continue on. So that's the first section, what we did. Now we want to talk a little bit about some further analysis we've done about what might have an effect on the error in our fit and how we can improve it. And to start, we would like to talk about which features seem most important for training on the daily data. So there are four features that we have considered. We have our images in red and infrared. And we also have the day of year. So this is where we just have a number for each image. Now, this seems important because, the model probably wants to know if this image was from September or from May. But this is a little bit problematic, this feature, because for one thing, when we get to the end of the year on January 1st, we go on this big jump back down to 1, even though there's no physical importance to that time. And then also, in general, it's good practice to have your features with mean of 0 and variance of 1, or at least of similar variances. And this feature definitely does not have that. So one possible replacement we came up with for the day of the year is something we call the cosine calendar. So this is where instead of this day of year number, 124, we can look at the values of these 6 cosine curves on this day and use that as our feature. So these cosine curves are just curves that we put over 365 days that all have different periods. So the idea is maybe by tracking the values along each of these curves, we can give the model an idea of when this image was taken. Now this has several advantages. We have the nice mean of 0 and variance of maybe not 1, but something close. And we also have a smooth feature without this jump. But there's also another advantage, is that we're using a convolutional neural network, and convolutions are good at learning things like derivatives and maxima and these sorts of things. And if we look at these cosines, there's lots of nice steep sections the model might be able to learn. Maybe it would learn to recognize these peaks. So it seems like there's more things that are natural for a convolution to latch onto. And then the final feature we considered is a quality assessment. So the daily images have these clouds. There might be some days when the sensor was broken. So it would be nice to give the model an idea of this. So we can tell the model a quality assessment for each image. We kind of treated this as a categorical variable where images are either ideal quality, less than ideal quality, or the image was not made. So an example of less than ideal quality would often be maybe an overflow error, something like that. An image not made might be there was a cloud in the way. And we can look at this. Oh, here we go. So here we see a plot of a bunch of different runs. We're only training with a full year of input, so this was not with the shortened data lengths. The idea is just to compare with these different features how well the model does. In yellow, we have with the day of year and cosine calendar. Oh, and I should mention this is just looking at the day of year and cosine calendar for now. So yellow and green have the day of year feature. And you'll notice that these seem to have a larger amount of error than the blue, which has no day of year. So this kind of makes it seem like if we take out the day of year, the model does better. Maybe the day of year is somehow confusing the model with these annoying things that we mentioned. Another thing is, if we look at the yellow and green with the day of year, there's more of these outliers with a worse validation error compared to the blue and maroon, which don't have the day of year. So maybe the day of year introduces sort of a chaotic element where we're more likely to have a problem converging. So with that in mind, it seems like it's a good idea not to include the day of year. We included it when we were doing the transfer learning before, so it'd be interesting to do that again without the day of year. Then for the cosine calendar, we can compare the blue to the maroon. The maroon has only the images with no cosine calendar, and the blue is the images with the cosine calendar. The blue looks nicer. We can also, here's a plot of the same thing where we have the mean values over those different runs, and then the shaded region, which is very hard to see, shows the standard error in the mean. But you'll notice that the when we have no day of year, but with the cosine calendar, that does seem to be the best. Finally, let's look at the image quality feature where we give the model an idea that there were clouds, that sort of thing. Yellow is without the quality feature, and magenta is where we have this quality feature added. The magenta and yellow mostly overlap, although it looks like there's maybe this one outlier in magenta. Overall, they look to be pretty similar. And when we do the standard error plots, they seem to overlap. So it seems like there's not much to be said here. One caveat for the stuff we've just looked at is that this is training with the entire data being real. So this could all change if we have a large portion of computed data. And so what can we conclude from this? Let's go find where we were. What can we conclude? We should include the images, of course, not use the day of year, include the cosine calendar, and for the quality assessment, it probably doesn't hurt, but we need more tests if we want to know if it actually helps.
So we also explore the relationship between the validation results and the choice of our study regions. There are two main directions that we tried investigating: the effect of the size of study regions or the dataset, and the effect of randomly selected pixels. For the size of the study regions, we have 5 different options: the original study region, 3 subregions with different sizes, and a very small region. For the second direction, we compare the performance between training on a fixed region or training on some number of pixels randomly selected across the largest possible region. This is one example of comparing different dataset sizes. We use 348 days as the constant input length, and we only take one patch for each year for a pixel. All of the 100 parameters, such as the learning rate or the number of epochs, remain the same for different runs. From the plot of training loss, we can see that when we decrease the size of the study region, the training loss goes down. The red curve on the top corresponds to the original study region, which is the largest one among our 5 different options. And the green one on the bottom corresponds to the smallest region we have. Our assumption for this is that naturally there should be less variability within a smaller study region, which could make it easier for a machine learning model to learn from and make predictions. And here is the plot of the validation losses for the same comparison group. In this example, we only calculate the validation loss based on the pixels within the training set instead of all of the pixels across the whole image. The plot of validation loss shares a similar pattern with the training loss. when we use a smaller study region, the loss decreases. However, comparing the validation loss in the training loss, we can find that the overfitting problem persists even with the smallest region as the training set. The validation loss is approximately twice or 3 times of the training loss. And here is another example for the experiments where we can randomly select pixels instead of taking a fixed compact region from the study region. We have 4 runs in this comparison group. The first run in blue curve is to train the model on 1,000 by 1,000 subregion taken from the original study region. And we calculate the validation loss based on this subregion only. The second run in orange is to train on the same subregion, but validate across the whole image. The third and the fourth one take the same number of valid pixels as the previous 2 runs, randomly across the whole image, and validate on either only the pixels within the training set or across the whole image. From this plot, we can see that the training loss for 4 different runs are not so significantly different. But for the validation loss for the same group, the training and validating on the same subregion results in the best performance, which we can tell from the blue curve on the very bottom. Next, for the cases where we randomly select pixels, the 2 validation losses are roughly on the same scale. Finally, corresponding to the orange curve on the very top, training on a fixed region and validating across the whole image will result in the worst validation performance. Our explanation for this finding is that randomly selecting pixels could bring us a better capability to cover different features across the whole image. Therefore, when we validate on the whole region, the case where we randomly select pixels will work better than training on a fixed, non-flexible region.
Okay, so those are a few thoughts on considerations for making a good fit. Now we want to talk about some future directions for the project and future implications of this sort of work. So a few ideas: training on ground truth labels instead of another model, comparing with other kinds of models, using the spatial information instead of looking at only one pixel at a time, and finally using ensemble models. We'll talk briefly about each of these.
So when our sponsor Josephine worked on her previous project, she did not train the model immediately with the 2 labels because the field observations sparsely distributed across the study region. The model was first trained based on the first bloom index because there are a lot of labels for the model to learn from. The 2 labels were only used to fine-tune the very last layer of the model at the final stages. There are 5 sample tuples of the pre-processed 2 labels on the slide. We plan to follow the steps of transfer learning in the same way as Josephine did. But due to the time constraint of the program, we did not have a chance to fully investigate or train our model with the 2 labels. One thing to notice is that the first bloom index is also inferred partially based on the ground truth observations recorded by National Phenology Network or provided by other scientists. So we believe that this should be an important stage to fine-tune the model if someone would like to continue working on this project in the future. And from all previous sections, it's not too hard to tell that we mainly rely on the approach of machine learning and convolutional neural networks. The reason is that we assume a complex model structure could better handle the multiple input features in the time convolution. However, it could still be interesting if we can compare our results with other simpler models with lower complexity, such as statistical regression models or random forests.
Yeah, and we also want to try out some idea from computer vision field. Since the landforms might have a higher possibility to occur together in the when considering to their geolocation. Let's say if you have a wetland here, and the surrounding area's chances to be wetland is higher than surrounding area to be desert. So that means if we try to blur the image by Gaussian filter, there might be benefits that we can increase the accuracy by removing the high frequency noise. So we might want to try for the blurring in the pre-processing progress. And I think by using dilation, that is also another way of doing the similar thing, but I guess there are two different ways of getting surrounding areas information for improving the accuracy.
Another way to use the spatial information would be to add a spatial convolution. So we only had temporal convolutions in time, but we could do a similar thing across different locations and just give the model neighboring pixels.
Yep. And another thing we would like to try, but we don't have time to try, is that we might want to add another ensemble layer at the very end, which means on top of our current neural network, we can add in another naive decision or not so naive decision, like this one, maybe not, because historically, phenologists generally use their experience, or they can just pick a average date or median date throughout the years and take that fixed value to be the threshold. But we can use some decision trees or something that is machine learning, but it's not technically neural network, to get this part, the naive decision part, or it's not so naive decision part. And the last layer can get the output from both neural network and the not so naive decision part. And hopefully the final layer can pick the right person when it comes to different scenario. Like this one will also be fed in the features from the sample itself. And hopefully this way we can improve the accuracy in a general pattern. Yeah. And lastly, we would like to bring our model to the social views part. Why we trying to want to make a better or less than perfect, but trying to be perfect model, because ideally a perfect model could predict fairly accurate, which means we can do some something that is beneficial to the social. Like, because nowadays there are different kinds of diversity problem in a different area. Not only we can promote the flowers blooming, but if we can accurately know when the blooming is happening, we can guiding artificial pollinator placement. So in this way, we can not only promoting the plant growth, but also we can increasing the pollinators population density. And another thing is that this is actually from my fiance, improving the honeysuckle quality and drive the development of related medicine industries, because honeysuckle is a really important traditional Chinese medicine material. And bringing that up, you can promote a whole industry for the medicine, growing a whole medicine industry. And lastly, because we have the tool to capture when the blooming will occur. Actually, we have a stronger gadget or method that we can intervene when there is a chaos in the biodiversity. So we can maintain a better ecological balance by improving our ability to manually intervene the ecological system. Okay.
Thank you for listening.
Right, thank you. Questions from the room or virtually? Oh, I see some hands up there. So, Josephine, if you can turn on your microphone.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, perfect. Thanks for the presentation. but I don't have my question formulated yet. So if someone else has a question, they can go ahead.
Actually, I saw Jean-Francois raise his hand earlier, but I think it's gone now, so maybe not. Julia?
Yes, if you don't mind clarifying, when you're saying about the blooming, right?
Yeah.
The first blooming, right, that happens.
Yeah.
It's a bit like interesting concept for me because it depends on the species, right? Because different species, so I just wonder how this works. Is it you're tracing just only like the most early blooming species across the whole, for example, area?
So you want to pick honeysuckle and get other species. Because this is from what is the data set, they only have that data provided to us.
Yeah, so like usually what would be done is you would have a different model for each species. It turns out that there is a lot of honeysuckle and lilac data available just because these are things people have in their gardens and there's been like people recording this for a long period of time. So for this reason, those species are often used kind of just as a special species we consider. The bloom index that we were using as our labels was trained based on 2 species of lilac and 2 species of honeysuckle. So what they did is they had a separate model for each species and then just averaged the models together to make like a combined first bloom index.
And how good is satellite images at catching that particular species? I'm just never worked with the images, so for me the question is why wouldn't I use the temperature which is readily available to train my model? Why would I go into images which is like a little bit trouble to analyze and work, occupy lots of space? So I'm just curious if you have any idea, like why would I go into the image analysis rather than using environmental data that is quite easily available right away?
Yeah.
Because blooming is not only affected by temperature, it's only like it will also affected by many features like the landscape, landform, and humidity, whether it's near to the ocean and what the latitude is, like that. So hopefully we have more features feeding to the model. The model would have a better result.
And like adding on to that as well, one limitation of the first bloom index that people have noticed is that it doesn't take into account differences in like acclimation of the species to different locations. So one hope is maybe you can sort of see this through satellites and like learn what different areas look like, but it's maybe a bit questionable if that would actually work. Another difference is that there are places in the world that don't have climate data necessarily. So if this was shown to work with satellites, we can easily like view the entire Earth from satellites. So we could potentially do this in places that don't have good climate data, or weather data, I should say.
Yeah,
But
because
the variation of that question is that since you have already added additional features like day of the year, quality. So the question is, do you think that you can add temperature as another feature, whether it will help? So this is not arguing about temperature or not, or satellite or not, but in exactly the same way that you have done, that you add both of them. Yeah. So maybe you would then have a daily, maybe a daily temperature that you actually feed into your model in addition to the satellite. So that's a possibility.
Yeah, I think this is like definitely a good idea and something that would be a good thing to do in the future. I know Josephine was mentioning this as well with the project. So yes, this is probably would be a good thing to explore.
And so, I mean, since we're talking about temperature, so if we're going to do it for temperature, then you say, oh, what a great, so I mean, so you could add a lot of meteorological features to add to the satellite images, and maybe that would actually improve the model.
Yeah.
I mean, the CNN doesn't really care. You could find all of those.
All right, now Josephine has a question. Over to you.
Yeah. So I was trying to come back to when you showed the different maps, we had your predictions for a certain year and the labels for that year and the difference. And so we saw several years, and it seems that you ran into one of the same issues that I had run into, which is the prediction looks very similar across the different years. So it looks like the model is learning some sort of an average more than the year-to-year variations. And I was wondering if you could, if you had thought about why this could be the case, or things that you could do to try to overcome this issue.
One possibility we are thinking about is that this model uses the imputed data. I assume that you're referring to this animation. So this one, we have the patch net to 212. So approximately like 1/3 of the proportion of the data we actually give to the model will be the imputed data. So they are kind of like flexible, non-flexible, they're kind of stable data for all of the time. So we assume that that might be the reason, because we didn't really enforce the model to pay more attention to the real data proportion. So they might strongly rely on the imputed data part. So for one of the future improvements, we thought that we could probably tell the model or somehow enforce the model to pay more attention to the real data part instead of the imputed data part, so that we can grab more like real-time information or practical information from the real data part to make variations when we do the predictions instead of just making the median or average value predictions. But if we look at the prediction maps really carefully, we can still see that there are some slight changes over the coastal line thing. So we assume that the model is learning something, but it's not like good enough or the most ideal way as we expected.
I think another approach you could do as well is, instead of getting the model to just predict the bloom day, you could get it to predict the difference between the bloom day and the naive model's prediction. And so that way you would kind of be decoupling it in a way from the spatial variation and forcing it to focus on what's happening in time. So that, I think, would be an approach that we would want to try if we were doing this again or continue.
Yeah, one thing it makes me realize as well is that in the data that we feed it, oh no, this is the first bloom index. So you do have time series at each pixel. I was thinking about the true labels where you oftentimes at each location only observe 1 year and not a lot of years. But here with the first bloom index, would there be a way to structure the learning in a way to pay attention more to the interannual variation than to the spatial differences? But I don't know. Yeah.
So I actually have a question on the exact same slide, and I don't know because you were playing this in animation mode, but if I'm seeing it correctly, I think the prediction for 2018 is better than 2019 and it's better than 2020.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what I'm seeing. So I was about to say, well, actually, I noticing climate change on the slide, because you are using so you're using 2001 to 2014 to predict 2018, and it's slightly more accurate than predicting 2019, and it's slightly more accurate than 2020. So the model is drifting actually in the same direction. So I thought it was interesting. But because we're playing in animation mode, I'm just trying to look at the end date. I mean, when you end your, when you end the training, and yeah, so I thought that 2018 is actually better than 2020.
Yeah, I think you're right with that observation. It does seem like the error is lower. We could probably investigate this more by looking at things like maybe the mean bloom date in 2018 was closer to the mean bloom date in the training set compared to those other years, and try and figure out what's causing this.
But it will be really interesting from the point of view of the model, now that you've done it, if you do a sliding. So for 2019, now you are going to use slide 1 year, so that there's always a 3-year gap, and then see whether you still have the same accuracy. And then it will be a very interesting comparison. So that's one part. So what happened to that corner? Because how come you guys always have the blue in that corner? So what is happening? Do you know?
No, we don't know.
Is it a data issue? Is it a cloud issue? So why is it always off by? So minus 30 is meaning that you predict too early, or is it too late? Minus 30 would be, I think.
Sorry, one thing to point out is that this model for all three plots in the animation, this model is from the Apple 68. This is not at a very final stage of the training process. It's just dragged in between the training process. It's kind of like in the middle, I guess, Apple 68.
I see.
It's not a final or finalized model after a bunch of training process.
But it might be interesting to find out why that corner is always like.
Yeah, I think that means we predict too late. Another interesting thing I think you can see looking at these pictures, it almost looks like here the colors are similar in the predictions to the labels, except in a way the colors are a little bit less extreme. And part of the reason for this might be like we initialized the model, so it's mostly just predicting the mean date, and then it kind of learns from there. So in a way, maybe it needs more time to train to like learn the more extreme areas. Like here, there's dark blue, and here there's a little more yellow, I think, than we see here. So maybe it needs more time to continue expanding out to kind of the more extreme places.
Well, I was exactly about to say that, when you talk about space, is that sometimes you need to pay attention to the discontinuities. And that's why I was looking at that corner, whether all of a sudden there's discontinuity. And that's why the models were really having trouble, whereas when they're in the middle, and particularly because of convolution, you might actually be able to do better in the middle than all the extremes because of the discontinuity. So that might be something there too, that you might need to do something about those discontinuities.
How big is the area you're working with in terms of kilometers?
The whole image is 4,000 times 4045 times 3615 pixels, and each pixel is 250 meters by 250 meters. It's kind of hard to make.
Yeah, so I just thinking like it looks like maybe it's like some subspecies or something, because I find like I work with species distribution, so I know how painful the whole process is. And sometimes what genetics is now, right, completely like changing the whole like taxonomy tree. So what we think might be the same species, it can be looking identical and everything can be completely genetically completely different and have completely different environmental envelope that you guys are catching here. But that's why you probably like completely failed to predict that area. Maybe they just starting. It seems like the area a little bit, right? Like you mentioned, right? That's secluded from the rest, which can be like leading to a kind of two suspicious there. Because maybe like earlier blooming due to like worse conditions there or something like that.
I guess that part might is resulted by the wind, because it looks like New York State, and there are ocean flowing from that direction every year. So that might be causing the temperature change. So I guess maybe if we want to resolve this issue, we might want to include more like temperature or wind direction, including more feature into the model.
Question about like the model architecture. I was wondering, if I'm understanding, like each pixel is essentially independent of each other. Yeah. So can we incorporate some like location embedding to the features or?
No, there's no location, so the model can't tell where the pixel came from.
Is there a reason that it's probably treated independent?
Because it's easier.
Yeah,
That's But yeah, I think that would definitely be something that we would want to look at if we were continuing the project, because it does seem like we have this sort of rich spatial information that we're just throwing out. So it would be nice to have like a blur or a spatial convolution to take advantage of that.
Sorry to add on to the answer, it's not only because it's easier to ignore the location information, that's because we have other different types of complementary data sources. One of them is called the modus properties, which records all the longitude and latitude information for all the pixels across the image. And the reason, one of the primary reasons we are doing this project is to investigate if the satellite image should be sufficient to make a good or decent prediction for the blooming onset date or blooming conditions. So if we throw the longitude and latitude information into the model, there could be the possibility that the model becomes a bit lazy, so it only depends on the longitude and latitude information, those geological information to make the predictions instead of like looking at the subtle difference in between the bands relevant to the spectral reflectance. So that's the kind of part of the reason why we didn't include the longitude and latitude information in tier 1.
We're trying to make our model really good that does not rely on any longitude latitude information and can predict from the picture like that. But definitely, if we were including more features, the effect would be better.
Right, I think that's it with the questions, and that wraps up the presentations, unless anybody has any other questions. We're good. All right, well, thank you so much for your presentation.